So, hello everybody. Dear all, let me extend my warmest welcome at this second day of the Critical Suicidology conference to all of you in this room. As Annie so kindly, where are you? Oh, she's gone. Okay, as Annie so kindly said, I'm a professor of gender studies and religious studies, and I work mainly in the intersection of Buddhist philosophy and queer and trans-feminist theory. And I do apologize that I had to miss the first day. In fact, I flew in yesterday from Hong Kong, where I attended another critical social justice advocacy conference. Some of you might have heard about it, the 15th Sakyadhita Conference of Buddhist Women. It was a wonderful conference. Now, as director of INCISE, I am proud to be a small part of this cutting-edge social justice turn in the study of suicide, which this conference embodies. INCISE is so grateful to provide what little support it can to this conference, although make no mistake whatsoever, the honor is all with our fantastic organizer team. And again, Annie stepped out, so she doesn't need to hear me praise her. So huge praise to Ian and Annie and all the wonderful people in the behind and beside the limelight who made this timely conference possible. Thank you. It appears fitting that a research orientation towards intersectionality and social justice should include a keen interest on academic questions and applied advocacy around well-being, mental distress, and suicide. As diversity-oriented feminism tells us, intersectional identity facets, including sex, gender identity, sexuality, or I prefer calling it variability, neurodiversity, race, ethnicity, cultural traditions, religious beliefs, age group, class, socioeconomic status, legal status, migrant status, veteran status, and so on. All these facets build up the shifting and flowing mosaic of our identity negotiations within societal contexts in the tension, the constant tension of equal versus unequal, just versus unjust, social participation and opportunities. When we look at the systemic failings of our societies to provide a nurturing and inspiring context for the thriving of our embodied identity performances, the unique intersectional cocktail behind each individual embodied experience of oppression, stigma, marginalization, exclusion, and violence becomes urgently important both for our advocacy and solidarity work and in the radical challenges we make to the systemic societal scripts which produce sustained trauma leading to self-completed deaths. Indeed, the work of this conference movement, if I can call it like this, I want to call it like this. Please become, if you're not a movement yet, become a movement. Of this conference movement, including Ian's important work on suicide and Foucault and Vicky Reynolds' groundbreaking advocacy thinking, this all could be described as the long overdue and crucially relevant social justice turn in the thinking around what, for the time being, I still call suicide, although I believe the term to be misleading and ultimately a misnomer. As some of you will know, my own thinking and research centers around questions of queer theory, transfeminism, and Buddhist critical constructive thought, or if you want, Buddhist practical theology, Buddhist liberation theology, and activism. Taking my cue from people such as Ian, Vicky, and others, I have grown to think about mental distress, suicidology, and self-completed deaths from a decisively systemic angle of social justice. And when in preparation for this little talk, which I basically did very jet-lagged yesterday, so if I'm waffling on, I do apologize, consulted the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus of the 3rd century before Common Era on the justified self-completed departure from life, I felt myself reassured about the nature of this term, for Chrysippus explicitly includes living and socio-economic injustice, penia, poverty, among his 5 reasons, tropoi, of justified suicide. Apart from the well-known Stoic ethical reasonings on the necessity of self-chosen death. I'm not going to elaborate on that in order not to bore you with some Greek fragments, but I think I felt quite chuffed about it. So there's already in the 3rd century something like a recognition of a social justice context. Widening this important impulse in Stoic philosophy, I emphatically, together with most of you, or all of you, support the shift away from individually framing and pathologizing occurrences of self-completed deaths. Indeed, discriminatory discourses and practices, for instance, religiously and or culturally underpinned, regularly point to high suicidality in so-called abject populations such as LGBTIQ plus people as an inferred proof of their moral inferiority. And as LGBTIQ identity performances as demonstrating in inherent mental disorder, the Catholic view on the disorderedness of LGBTIQ activities and identity expressions. But obviously research firmly shows that not the marginalized abject is mentally disordered, but that abjection, rejection, stigma, and systemic societal aggression creates the mental distress, manifesting in alarmingly high suicidology numbers, for example, among trans people in general, and also among LGBTIQ plus youths in particular. Taking the heightened prevalence of drug usage and risk-taking behavior within segments of the LGBTIQ community into consideration, risk-seeking and unhealthy behavioral patterns, again, appear not as proof for moral degeneration, but as reactions to the undue systemic mental pressure on these groups. They can be interpreted as less constructive attempts to develop resilience or as expressing unhealthy coping mechanisms, sometimes even akin to semi-conscious, prolonged, phased or gradual suicides. There's a huge discussion in Buddhist theology about gradual and sudden enlightenment, and there is also gradual and sudden suicide, the self-completed death. So we need, at this conference, thus, to look at the systemic causes for both gradual and sudden self-completed death among people living with social injustices. And we also need to examine the concrete, irresolvable, traumatic experiences which express, perform, and focalize such systemic causes and traumata. These traumata occur and get inscribed in the embodied experiences of intersectionally marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed people whose social trauma often proves deadly. Trauma, the Greek word for wound, becomes murder, in the Greek word phonos. I maintain that most suicides, with the scarce exception of those voluntary deaths, for example, that are consciously enacted for a higher ethical good in the, for instance, Stoic and Buddhist traditions, that most suicides should not be called suicides. When a veteran sent as a pawn of late capitalist and nationalist interests returns from the trauma of the killing fields, and having served their function to a cynical society which willingly made them a killer, slowly spirals into self-destruction, unable to make sense of their alleged heroism in the face of the reality of horror. Or when a trans girl of color, lacking resources and strategies of resilience, succumbs to the hopelessness and inevitability of stigma, abuse, violence, and poverty. Or when a mentally variable person signs themselves out of a life without respect, love, and basic inclusive access to opportunities. In all these cases, why are we calling it suicide? What should be called murder? Where systemic injustice has translated into sustained trauma, I would speak of delayed, self-completed murder. It's not suicide. It's a delayed, self-completed murder. Systemic, intersectional social injustices create sustained wounding, traumatic experience, which often become phonoic, killing wounds. So from trauma to phonos, from wound to murder. Now, this is the most difficult part of my talk. If you allow me to become personal for a moment, standing here in front of you, not as a fellow scholar and activist, but also surprisingly, most of all to me, alive, still. I am a suicide waiting to happen. I was murdered when I was born and put into a binary gender box. I was murdered every day in junior high, when the heavy lids of the metal rubbish containers closed over me, burying me into a reeking abyss of darkness which swallowed me as dehumanized refuse. I was murdered by gossip, by exclusion, ostracism of senior high school and at university, by the name callings and beatings, and only my body survived by an inch after one particular instance of bashing, for now. I was thoroughly and routinely murdered again and again as a young person who was sexually abused. I was murdered many times. And I do not tell you that to ask for sympathy. I tell you that as allies because I'm asking in society for respect and action. I survived my murders so far by becoming more than yet another smart-ass scholar, by becoming an activist. I turned from a very conservative philological education to become an activist scholar who doesn't live in the ancient texts anymore so much, although I still like them, but who wants to change things. This is where behind queering paradigms and the queer studies network I'm running and so on. Against an irreparable loss of meaning, I can only set fight against systems that allowed my murders. And I know the shadows, and I know they will come, and I know eventually I shall embrace them like lovers. Until then, I will try to fight. So, let's do two things. Firstly, let us celebrate survivors and victims of traumatic and phonoic injustice. We rightly call those whose souls were murdered, for instance by child abuse, survivors of abuse and trauma. And we need to acknowledge that not all survive. Not all can find resilience in network, in humor, in some sort of meaning making. Not everybody is able to reconstruct meaning out of the ruins of an utterly meaningless life after the murder of the soul. Be that a murder in one dramatic event which expresses systemic injustices and power imbalances, or murder by constant phonoic microaggressions and micro-killings. Let us celebrate all of them and remember in fondness those we have lost to delayed self-completed murder. Secondly, let us stop blaming the victim. Stop reducing, rationalizing, and minimizing the real systemic violence behind those murders. And let us create meaning for our own wounded selves through that kind of activism and advocacy that explodes the centers that create the margins and that create the suffering. Let us dream and create ways of being and becoming which celebrate each of our sameness and uniqueness equally, without othering and stigma, with true empathy and respect. Now, this conference series is so important for these goals. Thank you. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for taking on this hard task. Thank you for being part of this social justice turn and suicidology, and for giving voices to all of us who have been murdered. Thank you.